It's quite a grim news diet at the moment, so it's with some trepidation that I turn us on to this next story, which is all over the front of the newspapers. It is what happened to Huw Edwards in court yesterday. The disgraced former BBC News presenter admitted to possessing indecent images of children, having exchanged WhatsApp messages with a man who was later convicted on paedophilia charges. There's two things here, isn't there? There's how awful the actual crime is that he's now been convicted of, and there's also the downfall, as some of the papers characterise it as. Someone who was the most trusted figure in news across the UK, trusted with those really important moments, who has now very steeply declined into disgrace. Jeff, what do you make of all of this?
Look, I mean, the admission and the guilt and the severity of the crime speaks for itself. I think that the whole pattern of it was rather bizarre. When the story first broke, I think a lot of people, because of pre-existing feelings about the Sun newspaper as a publication, went, full into Huw defence mode without really looking at what was being alleged there. A concerned parent went to the BBC, didn't feel that they were getting the help, then went to the Sun about a vulnerable somebody in their late teens and then early 20s who was alleged to have drug dependency issues. And this was like the most powerful broadcaster in television. And again, it's this double standard thing coming up, whereby we were told in Me Too, some of it was about power and abuses of power and what you need to do. It might not be illegal, but how do you manage your power? And it was astonishing to me the way that people went out to bat blindly for the guy, because I sort of thought, well, if this is the worst thing, right? Okay, but it didn't feel like it would be. And I sort of felt as well that if I had a mate, right, of a similar age, forget whether or not he's this broadcaster that covers the Queen's funeral, just a friend of a similar age, and they'd have explained that situation where a concerned parent had got in touch and, sexual images were being sought that could have been funding a drug issue. I would have been concerned about that guy, right? I wouldn't have just gone out and said, well, Steve's all right, Steve's a good guy. So the whole way that a part of the kind of media establishment tried to cover up, and it felt like it was more because of pre-existing feelings about the Sun newspaper than actually treating the first story on merit.
Yeah.
And sadly, we see that that was in many ways the tip of a very grim iceberg.
It's not just people's feelings about the Sun newspaper, though, is it, Ashley? I mean, there was also mixed into that how people felt about Huw Edwards, someone who had been on their TVs, on the biggest news bulletin in the land for 20 years, who broke the news to many people that the late Queen had died. It was difficult for many people to get their heads around that, wasn't it?
It definitely feels very personal. Like you invite these people, in a sense, into your home, and to find out that this person has such a dark history and dark side to them, and absolutely the worst, connections to the worst things that basically anybody can think about. It does feel very intimate, and it feels like a betrayal, as I said. The other aspect of this is that, people often feel morally scolded by the BBC. That there's just the most sort of right-on opinions, and everything else was, censored out of non-existence. That's been the criticism of the BBC, or at least that there has been a kind of heavy influences on language to ensure little offense and so on. And then to see something like this happen, where the BBC allegedly knew about Edwards' arrest in November, but continued to employ him on a £479,000 salary until his resignation in April, is really, really shocking. So it's intimate to have this person come into your home, but then also to know that you were paying that person essentially out of your taxes is understandably extremely shocking.
Jeff, what do you think about the questions that are still outstanding for the BBC? There's lots of discussion of that this morning in terms of what Ashley was saying there about the fact he was being paid, given a pay rise for some of this period. I mean, is there anything they have to answer on this?
I mean, I just don't know how you find yourself in this position, because sadly, it's not the first time, obviously, with the BBC and a story like this. So I don't know what the logic is in those meetings. I guess they probably have followed it to the sort of letter of the HR law. But again, you wonder if there's other things that he'd have been accused of, whether they would have gone, right, we'll cut our losses here. But yeah, arresting and giving pay rises, I think all of it is sad, because I'm not somebody that I believe in the BBC. I think a national state broadcaster has an important place, but just it's almost like at every turn decisions are made which make it a lot harder for them, and they've got legitimate questions to answer.
one of the most trusted figures, the anchor who for decades fronted the flagship BBC News Bulletin, told us that the Queen had died, took over from Dimbleby to steer us through election nights, and presented those national moments like the coronation. Huw Edwards admitted yesterday possessing indecent images of children, having exchanged WhatsApp messages with a man who was later convicted on paedophilia charges. It is difficult to hear. He viewed 377 sexual photographs, including 41 indecent images of children, 2 of which were as young as 7. The BBC said it was shocked at what they described as abhorrent behaviour. But there are clearly questions for the broadcaster's executives who kept him employed on full pay. Covering this story closely, of course, Alex Farber, the Times media editor, who's with us now. Alex, good morning.
Morning, Rosie.
Alex, what did we learn in court yesterday?
So in court yesterday, we learned the shocking news that Huw Edwards pled guilty to 3 charges of viewing and receiving indecent images of children. Some of them were very young. This related to a period around 18 months from December 2020. He appeared in court. He was not expected to plead guilty. I think that took everyone slightly by surprise. We discovered that the magistrate said that sentencing would take place in around mid-September. He requested a report that would provide him with more information about Huw Edwards' motivations, the kind of person he was, his risk of reoffending. He requested that report be delivered from probation by mid-September before he decided what course of sentencing to take, and he warns that he may not have in his powers the ability to pass a significantly serious sentence, so it could well be passed on to a Crown Court for sentencing.
I think we should be really clear. I know this has been reiterated, but I'd like to do it now. The term making an image, it could give the wrong impression as to exactly what he's charged of. It is receiving a picture, having it downloaded on your phone, rather than sort of, taking the photograph yourself.
That's right, Rosie. So Huw Edwards was involved in one-to-one WhatsApp conversations with another individual who ultimately went on to be convicted of child abuse charges himself. And Edwards was sent these messages by that individual over a period. There was quite some messages, several hundred that were exchanged, several hundred images exchanged over a period. But no, the suggestion Huw Edwards himself wasn't making images, but what is clear is that he was being sent, receiving and viewing these images, and some of them were of very, very serious nature indeed. They fell into a category A category, which is reserved for the most serious kinds of imagery and some videos too.
And in the messages, at one point, Huw Edwards says to the person that he's messaging, no, don't send anything illegal.
Yeah, that's right. The extent to which that is defensible or not, I mean, he did request that there was no more messages of an illegal nature sent, but it's worth noting that they exchanged messages for quite some time. And whilst he did specifically request no more illegal messages were sent, he was exchanging messages with this other man. They were continuing to share other kinds of images, which I believe were inappropriate and indecent. And they clearly had some kind of relationship. And what Huw Edwards certainly didn't do, as I think any right-minded person would go to the police as soon as he was receiving and being sent such pictures.
There's obviously been a real sense of shock. You said, people weren't expecting that he would plead guilty. I know you've been speaking to some of his former colleagues. Can you give us an idea of what the sense and the mood is like in amongst the BBC right now?
I mean, people are very angry. They feel that they feel let down. They feel disgusted. People are deeply, deeply unimpressed with the actions. Not least because many of them, if not defended, then were certainly sympathetic privately towards Huw Edwards around a year ago when previous allegations unrelated to this incident emerged in the Sun newspaper, in which Huw Edwards was alleged, people might remember, was alleged to have had a relationship with a young person and exchanged messages with that individual. The Metropolitan Police looked into that case and ultimately ruled there was no criminal activity. Having said that, Huw Edwards was suspended over that and suffered and never returned to work. He quit the corporation several months after in April. But nevertheless, some people felt slightly uncomfortable about his downfall in that sense. What the events of this week have done have just really blown that out the water, and really people feel catastrophically let down by his actions.